First of all, let me thank you for accepting our humble invitation to join our discussion. I want to welcome all the attendees who are joining us live, but also who will be joining us for our recording afterwards for our new webinar / podcast style energy talk. This is a new concept myself and my colleague Hasala Dharmawardena came up with very recently, looking at what's going on. A small introduction about ourselves. We are both the Ph.D. students and we both have a small background about energy policy. We've been reading on what's going on. We've been sort of following everything that's been going around. So our discussion, our motivation for really doing this is that, especially with this topic right now, is that we understand a lot of the new younger people in the energy sector, engineers don't really know what happened during the 1980s, during the 1990s, but afterwards when Sri Lanka's energy sector sort of fundamentally changed, sort of electrification went from 40% to near 100% more recently. So what actually that happened? Hasala, do you have anything to add on your side of motivations?
Yes. So I have found out that throughout the world that people tend to think talking about policy, it's something that you need to be like maybe perhaps retired, or you need to have like 30 years experience to talk about policy. But and this is something that I have experienced through even the IEEE USA Energy Policy Committee. And my personal opinion is that we need the younger people talking about this, and not just talking about it, but talking about reading about it and debating about it on a professional platform. And I see a lot of people, even engineers from my university, who are talking about energy policy and just saying, ABCD said that, so that is how it should be done. So my opinion is that we provide a platform for people to get context on why it happened, from 1950s, how it started with Vimala Surendra. Perhaps we can go that far another day, but then how did it convert? And you need to know the why to talk about the present and the future. Without having that context, we really can't give a reasonable debate or argument or something to think about. So that context is what we want and what we want to set, and we should go towards the future as well after that.
That's very true. It's important to understand how we got here, what factors influenced where we are, to really understand the problems in the context right now. So, without keeping Dr. Siyambalapitiya waiting anymore, I think Dr. Siyambalapitiya is a very well-known expert in the field. He needs no introduction. You might know him as an energy consultant, energy economist, energy expert. But what you might not know is that he is also an energy sector reformer. He was a very bold reformer during the 1990s, even afterwards. And then his role, I think, was very crucial to really making some of the changes in the energy sector for the better. So, to get things started, to start off the discussion, and welcome Dr. Siyambalapitiya to our humble show. Why don't you start with like a brief introduction about your history, like when you were an undergraduate at University of Moratuwa, what got you started in the energy sector? Or were you interested in the energy sector before you went to Moratuwa? What really made that spark? What was the thing for you?
Thank you very much, Tisura and Hasala, for having me on this program. And let me start off with how I got into this sector. When I went to University of Moratuwa in 1978, I had no idea as to which stream of engineering I will finally select. But as we all know, at the end of the first year, you have to make up your mind. And by that time, I had opted that I will go into electric power. So, of course, I had to be frank that I could be one of the very few people who provided electric power as the first choice. Because given the level of engineering activity that was going on in the country in 1978-79, civil engineering was the field of choice of many, because that's where the jobs were available. So, and but I opted to give power engineering as my first choice, and then went on, completed my degree at Moratuwa, and of course, as usual, had the in-plant training at CEB. At that time, there was no LECO. And the day after my final exam, I joined the Ministry of Power and Energy on a temporary basis. They had just started off a special activity on energy efficiency, promotion of energy efficiency. So Sri Lanka was talking about energy efficiency almost for the first time,
In the
particularly on
1980s?
1982. So in fact, the exam was over on Friday, and I joined this activity in the ministry even without a letter of appointment, because the ministry had just started off a new energy efficiency drive, uh, meaning that particularly on the industrial sector. So they wanted somebody to coordinate all this work. So I joined there. So anyway, to make a long story short, then I worked in CEB. Of course, I was recruited to CEB and seconded to the ministry. So I worked there for years on the energy efficiency, energy policy, and renewable energy task forces. There were 3 task forces in operation, and I was a coordinator for all the 3 task forces. So that's 2 years of introduction to the energy sector and the people who matter in the energy sector. So through that, of course, I got to know almost everybody in the CEB hierarchy and almost everybody in the petroleum hierarchy, as well as the government department and institutions, Ministry of Finance. And you would believe that I was only 23 years. By that time, I had met President J.R. Jayawardena twice on energy matters, because he was the Minister of Energy, right? So I used to draft memos for his signature at that time, and still being a very young person in the sector. Anyway, then 3 years of leave for my postgraduate studies, returned to CEB and joined the planning branch. Then 7 years as the chief engineer, well, initially as the engineer and thereafter the chief engineer in the generation planning branch. Then I worked for 4 years doing exactly the same job in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi electric company, planning the electric power system, the generating system for Saudi Arabia. And then now we are in 1998, I returned to Sri Lanka. And in spite of many invitations to rejoin CB, rejoin ministry, etc., I opted to stay out of the government structure, for that matter, any other corporate entity, and set up, and together with 2 other engineers whom I had known for a long time, with a chemical engineer and a mechanical engineer. So the 3 of us set up our own consulting company, which is called RMA. So and that is significant, mechanical and chemical. So so then we started our consulting work in our respective fields. And today still we are a relatively smaller company of 10 full-time engineers and a large number of consultants who work on our projects. And we largely work on power sector projects in Sri Lanka and abroad. And that includes power generation, conventional as renewable, and transmission, distribution, policy, energy pricing, electricity pricing, uh, as well as a little bit of work in the petroleum industry. And of course, very significantly, a lot of work we have done in the last decade, decade and a half, I would say, on renewable energy, resource assessment, pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies, starting from small mini hydros for individual mini hydro development companies to the feasibility study for CEB's upcoming 100 megawatt wind power plant. We had a fairly significant role in the initial stages of that project. So that's a full, perhaps a brief summary of what we are doing.
Yes.
At this moment,
Yes.
we are working in 6 different countries, uh,
Mm-hmm.
similar projects in advising governments, utilities, developers on
Mm-hmm.
projects in the power sector.
Excellent, excellent. See, Hasala, we are talking to the right person who has been in the energy sector from long time ago onwards. Hasala, over to you.
Yes. So what I would like to know from you is like, okay, I understand like what your history was, but why electrical engineering? Why join the ministry? Like, was it because there was a good opportunity to impact, or was it because you were passionate and you saw a problem that needed to be solved? Or was it because of the people who invited you, your mentors, or something like that? What's the inner spark?
I would say it's the people. It's the people. We are talking about an era when there was no internet, no email, and it's only word of mouth that carries most of the information. So it's a message from the ministry task force leader, Professor Munasinghe, to Professor Karunaratne, who was my professor, as to whether there is anybody whom he would recommend to join the ministry to coordinate these activities. So
Mm-hmm.
it was a time that students perhaps have no very clear career objectives even when they graduate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter of getting a job, and of course, at that time, say the electric power engineering group was only 28 people. Today, it is 100, and at that time, it was only 2 universities. Right now, I think we have perhaps a dozen universities, both government and semi-government. So.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, opportunities were also limited. So what it mattered was, who asked you whether you would like to join and with whom you would be working. So definitely I was impressed by the structure they had set up in the Ministry of Energy at that time. And I have to say that the Ministry of Energy presently does not have that structure. At that time, it was a very attractive place to work. So that's why
Mm-hmm.
I started work even without a letter of appointment.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So, Dr. Simrapit, so for some of us who were born after the 80s, can you tell us what was the energy sector like back in the days? How was planning done? What was the regulation structure? Who was the authority that was really in charge of not just the CP, but the petroleum and the energy sector? And given that there was no regulator at the time, was it the ministry that was sort of really regulating? Give us your take on the broad, big picture of the energy sector.
So the industry was governed by the Electricity Act of 1950.
Mm-hmm.
The Act of 1950. And there was a Ministry of Power, Energy, and Telecom, if I remember right, prior to 1980. That was the time that we had only a few ministries. And as the saying goes, as school children, we always had to remember the names and portfolios of the ministries, because ministers as well, because they were only about a dozen, so we could actually remember.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the time that almost all, I would say, anything water related was grouped into one ministry plus telecommunication. Anyway, by the time I joined, it was Ministry of Power and Energy. And strangely enough, the Petroleum Corporation, which was a major player in the energy sector, was under the Ministry of Industries. It was under the Ministry of Industries, but within a year or so, it was brought under the Ministry of Power and Energy. So, of course, this phrase power and energy is something I do not like, because power means electricity, energy means biomass, electricity, petroleum, renewables, everything. So it's like calling Ministry of Mobile Communication or Ministry of Mobile Communication and Telecom, right? Power is a subset of energy. So I have always been pressing, as they do in many other countries, to simply call it the Ministry of Energy. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
that part, uh, the Energy Ministry was supervising the Electricity Board, at that time, and shortly thereafter, perhaps by the mid 80s, the Petroleum Corporation as well, the key energy
Okay.
institutions.
And the CB was created in the 1960s somewhere, no?
69. So
1969.
69, CB was a government department. So, at that time, there would have been some progressive thinking. I would say that would have been the first step in the reforms of the electricity sector to convert CEB into a corporation. So, the thinking at that time was that, you know, commercial activities should remain in the government's hands, but they are better managed if they are structured as government-owned corporations or boards. So, a category of institution was emerging, which was handling the commercial activities. So, by that time, the National Paper Corporation, Textile Manufacturing Corporation, etc., all these things were in operation, but all government owned, and there was only very few large scale utilities or industries managed by the private sector. So 1969 would be called the first step towards reforms in the electricity industry. Now,
Mm-hmm.
not visualize, what's the difference between a government department and a board or a corporation. In
Mm-hmm.
simple terms, the board or a corporation manages its own financial matters. They make their own decisions. The only difference is that the board of directors is appointed by the government. Otherwise, it's just as good as a private company in which all shares are held by the government. And the difference between that and a government department is that all income of a government department goes to the treasury. And that the government department gets an annual allocation for their capital and recurrent expenditure. So the problem in such a setup is that because it's a commercial activity, it has to be closer to the customer. So when money income goes to the government, and then you have to get a government budget for your improvements, maintenance, staffing, etc. There is a hindrance because there is a lot of other pressures on government budget. So that's why at that time it had been thought, it was well before I joined the sector, that the electricity industry should be managed by a board. So 1969, a board was set up called Ceylon Electricity Board, which took over all the activities of the previously known government department and continued to expand. But we were looking at a situation where only 25% of the country's households had electricity, even in 1980. So activities progressed. By about mid 1980s, specific focus was given for network
Mm-hmm.
expansion.
Okay.
So,
Um,
yes.
Dr. Siyambalapitiya, can I ask, when the CB was created, did the CB took over a utility that was like a private electric company that was there before, or did they sort of like? I'm sure there must have been something before the CB, right? Correct?
Well, the history of the
Public work.
industry is that initially electricity distribution was set up by private companies
Correct
focused
companies.
on cities. So Colombo City obviously had the first private company. They had generators, I think, based in Colonnava as well as in Peta,
Mm-hmm.
and had a relatively local distribution network.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, Kandy, similarly Badulla, and some of these networks were owned by the municipalities.
I see. Interesting.
Uh, and then, probably in the 1950s, together with the Electricity Act, all these generating assets were taken over by the government Department of Electrical Undertakings. So, before CB was set up, all the privately run or municipality run networks were absorbed, generating systems were absorbed to the Department of Government Electrical Undertakings. But that did not mean that all distribution was done by this government department. That taking that transfer, today what we see, there are only two distributors in the country. LECO, and CEB. But at the time CEB was set up, there were more distributors than CEB in the country. Say, Kent municipality was a distributor. Badula municipality was a distributor. Kiribati Pradeshi Sabha was a distributor. Kolonava Urban Council was a distributor. So there was a large number of distributors even when CEB was set up in 69, which continued until about 1990 when all these distributors were taken over either by the CEB or by LECO. So if I may track the history, so 69 CEB was set up. So by that time, all generation to the grid was owned by the government department, of which the assets were taken over by CEB. So then matters progressed, I would assume, relatively slowly into 1970s. As we know, the first part of 70s was a period of lower growth, and the second half of 70s saw an exponential increase in electricity demand, and in fact, the highest ever year-on-year growth that we have recorded happened in that 1978 to 1980 period. If I remember right, it was 14% per year in one of those years, the growth. So that's because of industrial expansion. So anyway, uh, the household electrification, in fact, was the focus because that's what people were asking for. That's what, of course, given our political culture, the politicians would like to give their voters and promise at the election. So that was the focus. So there were project after project after project funded by various international agencies, including local budgetary funds, to bring the electrification level of the country to 100%. So with a lot of effort, in 2016, Sri Lanka officially declared that we have reached every possible household. So of course, statistically, it is not exactly 100%. I don't think any country has 100% because you always have the very remote household, the farmhouse, the holiday bungalow on the top of a hill, which is very expensive to supply. So plus a few houses that have legal difficulties in getting a connection. So it's never 100%, but we are almost there. Passing easily for 99.5% of household electrification. So that's the electrification focus. But I think separately we'll have to talk about transmission and generation focus.
True. I know the 1980s is a very sort of particular interest of Hasala. So before I sort of give Hasala, I have one question to ask. What were the major, that you said before households were electrified, there were a few industries at the time. What were the major big customers or the big industries at the time who were the bulk of the CB customers in the 80s, 70s time?
Well, still in the early part of 80s, the manufacturing industries owned by the government were still the largest customers. I don't remember statistics offhand, but most likely about 40% of electricity was sold to manufacturing industry. And among manufacturing industry, although I said there was an exponential increase in late 70s and early 80s for manufacturing industry, but the largest was still the government-owned traditional industries such as Tulhiriya Textiles, Cement Corp. In fact, if you consider the largest single electricity user, still it is a cement company in Putlam. Is the single largest electricity user in one premises in the country.
Interesting. Even larger than Steel Corporation and Chico?
Yes, because Steel Corporation is using oil. Now other steel companies are using arc furnaces, but given the scale, it is still the largest single user. Of course, if you consider the largest single customer, it is a water board. Water board is the single customer, but they are scattered all over. So anyway, so the industrial demand also increased, but in parallel, household electricity consumption also increased. So as the figures stand today, the share of electricity used by households is 38%, and the share of electricity used by manufacturing industry is 25%, and the balance goes to commercial activities. So in percentage terms, household electricity consumption is stagnant at 38%. The share of industrial electricity use is declining, and the share of commercial sector electricity use is increasing, the shares. But
Was
overall,
it
absolute numbers are increasing.
was it because of a deindustrializing trend after the 1980s, like late 80s?
I would say the structure of the economic growth changed. So
Changed, yes.
focus came into the commercial sector. Uh, the electricity used in commercial activities, which is financial, education, offices, supermarkets, etc., grew faster than the electricity used in manufacturing industry. So there are other underlying economic realities as to why this is growing in this fashion. But the reality, as shown by the statistics, is what I said.
Of course. Hasala.
Yes. Oh, so when I graduated, or when I started, when I started my studies at University of Dharmawardena, the first the Electrical Engineering Society AGM that I participated, it was the last at the Selinco building, if I can remember correct. And it was the vice president of that of the ISOC at that point was Nadira, and can't remember. So Melinda was the computer. He was the MC. I don't know if you can remember, but you had a very inspiring presentation on the energy sector. You were presenting about coal, and the panel was really very. So that is where I got interested in learning about this, reading about this, and getting into debates. And I can remember I got into a debate with the author Daya Disanaika, who was very vocal about his opposition to the energy policy at that point of time. The points on, like, we were like saying that coal should be the major force and things like that. But so, like, I would like to know, like, when you graduated, so were you happy with what's happening? Like, you can look at the electricity board. Were you okay with the structure, with the way they operated? And then the larger picture, what about the ministry and how the politicians impacted the policy making? For instance, we had Mahavali, right? So Mahavali projects, say Victoria, like, did you have any suggestions for improvement, criticisms, or favorable reviews on how it should have been done? Like, why Victoria? Like, why have that much of a large, power plant? What, it was not required, or it was too much of a weight on the economy? What was your take? Were you happy with what's happening, or did you have any complaints and suggestions for improvement?
All right. So if we look at the hydropower development, in fact, much of the hydropower development had been designed and in fact built by the time we joined the sector. So there was hardly any opportunity for my generation to make any comments on the structure and the decisions that have been taken about the development of hydropower as well as irrigation systems in under the Mahavali River Development Program, particularly the accelerated Mahavali development. So the scenario at that time was that all the projects were being built at very high speed, and a lot of engineering and financial resources were dedicated uh, to these projects, and a very strong political support and kind of a no-nonsense political will to get these projects through. And everybody was looking forward to reaping the benefits of the Mahavali projects. So people were being moved from areas that were to be submerged by reservoirs by the time, in the mid-80s, and most of the major dams were under construction. And everybody was looking forward, or the people who were relocated were looking forward to a new life in the new Mahavali areas with good surface irrigation. People who have been suffering from lack of water for irrigation. So quite a lot of, I would say, positive thinking at that time. So it doesn't mean that we were all happy with what's going on. But looking back, and particularly looking back in comparison with the large degree of indecision in the electricity industry. Let's limit our discussion to electricity industry that happened in the 1990s, and even after then, I see that what happened in late 70s and early 80s with regard to hydropower development and the speed at which these projects were implemented was super. Just to give you a simple example, as undergraduates, okay, there was a change of government in mid 77, and when we went on the field visit in late 79, the foundation for the Victoria Dam was already complete. So just imagine a policy decision and the required studies and the financing and appointing contractors and giving the consultancy total responsibility to our own Central Engineering Consultancy Bureau, and start building the Victoria Dam, and having reached the ground level in 2 years, in total 2 years. Today, if we consider, let's take the major project in hand in the power sector, LNG import terminal. The feasibility study was done in 2013, and the recommendations were written and approved in 2014, and still we are talking about it. 6 years later, we are still talking about it, which way to go, which country will build it, etc. So we see that compared with what's happening today, the political will was strong and very focused and target oriented, and very little interference. And the targets were ensured by the political authority. So, for example, as the saying goes at that time, the president appointed the minister, and the minister appointed the contractor and the consultants. And the only thing president wants to know is on which day will the inauguration be, so that I can mark the date in my diary. He would not interfere, as the saying goes. I do not know the inner workings of the government. He would not interfere in minor matters or even contractor selection in projects. So that was given the total responsibility to the political authority and the professionals who were running the Mahaweli ministry. Anyway, so as I said, we had very little opportunity to even comment on what was going on. But towards the latter half of 1980s, the Samalalawaba project came in for design and discussion. So that's where, as you know, that was the largest project. Still, it was officially under the Ministry of Mahaweli, but actually the project was built by the Electricity Board. So that was the time that we had some insight into the modeling and the reservoir optimization, etc., etc. So we did make some comments, but of course not on the geological problems that subsequently erupted of the Samalalawaba project. So that's about the time that we had some say as a group, as young professionals, about the future course that should be taken by CEB and Sri Lanka with regard to power generation. So of course there's a lot to share. Perhaps that completes what I would like to say on major hydropower development. Of course, subsequently built Upper Kotmale hydroelectric project that was subject to a lot of controversy, and the Kukule hydroelectric project, once again, that was subject to a lot of controversy, and that's a project that went through the approval process during my time as the chief engineer, generation planning. So we had a completely different view on how Kukule project should be developed. But owing to various, I would say different kinds of submissions to the political authority, the Kukule project was scaled down. And, a lot of professional discussions that we could have as to how Kukule project could have, in fact, resolved the flood problem of Kaluganga. So, Madurelia, all these places would never have gone underwater as it happened over the last decade, many times over the last decade, had the Kukule reservoir been allowed to be built by CEB. So hydropower plants, the major ones, if you ask your grandparents or great-grandparents, Colombo City went under water before 1950. Why doesn't it happen today? Because much of the water is regulated upstream in Lakshapana and other power plants. And secondly, of course, Colombo has a flood protection scheme. So it is these two that keeps the Kalaniganga under check for most of the time, except for one or two incidents that happened in the last decade. So, but floods were more frequent when you do not have regulation upstream. So the same would have happened to Kukule in regulating the water flow in Kaluganga. Kukule is a tributary of Kaluganga in managing the water flow of Kaluganga in preventing floods downstream. So anyway, a lot of things here as to
Yes.
how things could have been done better with regard to major hydropower development. Later we can talk about thermals.
Exactly. There's a lot to talk about if we really go down that path. Hasala, did you have a follow-up question or?
A very short
Uh,
question. So,
uh-huh.
who were the critics, and what was there any critique about this, or did they allow it, or was there suppression of criticism of the government projects? Who are the people that comes to your mind, like when it comes to that era? Like, who was the Dr. Tilak? Who was the other people, the environmentalists who were standing against? You can have a lot of arguments against hydropower as well, and some have very valid reasons to oppose them. But who are the people, and what were the arguments? Can you remember something from that time?
Well, I would say, of course, there were my predecessors in CEB's planning division, Dr. P.N. Fernando, Mr. D.V.N. Fernando, who were my predecessors in the seat of Chief Engineer Generation Planning in CEB. So they were good analysts, modeling, optimization, etc., were things that they would practice day in and day out. Then, of course, each project has a project team set up either by the Ministry of Mahavali. I'm talking about hydro, either Ministry of Mahavali or CEB. So the project management unit or the project director for all Mahavali projects were with the Ministry of Mahavali, whereas it was unique that Samanalavava and Kukule were CEB projects, and CEB had project directors and project teams for these two major hydropower plants. So, but people who were, I would say, critically commenting on these projects, I would say to a large extent were not very visible or organized in the same way that you find today. So I remember having an open seminar at Moroto University, possibly in about 1992, about Kukule project. So a university student group had organized a seminar to which they invited us as the project proponents, and they invited people from the area, and the clergy and various local organizations would come, and basically their argument was that the larger reservoir should not be built, and it should be built as a run-off river project. So our thinking was that it should be built as a peaking power plant because we need peaking power. So Kukule project, if I may, because that's a project that went through during my time. And of course, personally, I'm very sad that the total potential of Kukule was not harnessed, not particularly for energy, but for peaking capability as well as flood protection capability was not harnessed. And even today, I feel sad that I let it go. I let it go and let the protesters had their way. Of course, they had a point. X number of temples would have gone underwater, 5 schools would have gone underwater, very fertile tea plantations would have gone underwater because the reservoir, I remember the number, even 20 square kilometer surface area, right? And the power plant Kukule, which is much smaller today, 70 megawatt, would have been double the capacity if we had the reservoir together with the production capability. Anyway, so the commentators or people who are giving a different point of view, I would not say they would have been technically qualified or they were not analytical, but they were responding to the loss of assets. that was the main argument. But largely, the project was, of course, designed by, Central Engineering Consultancy Bureau had a very big say in the designs of all these projects. Very strong and very capable organization at that time. I hope it still is.
Yes.
Of course, when the political decision is made, of course, for any project, there are options, and you can calculate the costs and the benefits and the impacts and the environmental, social impacts, but finally somebody has to make a decision. So therefore, the decision was made to make it a runout river project. So uh, the answer to your question is that if you talk about the early 80s, late 80s, the project, I would say, I would not like to call them the opposition, but the people who critique the projects in the power sector were not adequately organized. So, I mean, in other words, I would say they were not people with whom we could discuss anything. So, I mean, we could not tell the chief priest of a temple, say that, look, this is our calculation model and this gives this benefit. And the irrigation engineers say that, this is the flood protection, flood management capability of this reservoir. So we need to consider that as well when we make a decision on the project. So that's not the group of people with whom we could have that kind of a healthy and frank discussion, and then perhaps get them to think differently as well. So most of
Yes.
the decisions would have been taken in the 80s and early 90s based on emotions, asset losses rather than optimization. Of course, calculation optimization were available.
Of course, of course. So, Dr. Siyambalapitiya, now I am trying to wrap my head around how all of this comes together in sort of forming a long-term sort of energy planning process. Now you mentioned about the major irrigation projects in the 1980s, and I know they were a big deal, especially when my parents are also in university. Like they were very proud of those projects coming up, and then really supplying energy and water for irrigation projects and all. But if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, energy sort of like water for sort of hydropower for energy generation was not the big, at least were probably part of the objectives of those projects, but there were other irrigation objectives, there were other flood protection, farming, everything that was involved in it. So, and you mentioned before that during the 80s and maybe the late 70s, the country was going through a transition. More and more households were electrifying, then industries were also changing. So how did all of this come together? And maybe were there somebody looking at the big picture of long-term energy planning? Like if the government had a plan to electrify this many countries, then they'll calculate, oh, we need this much demand within the end of the decade by 1990 or early 2000. Um, was there someone sort of keeping track of what was going on? If the hydropower plants were not, if they did not come about, was there an alternative plan at the time? Were there any other source of energy? Like, was everybody sort of hoping for hydro to come, or if hydro didn't come, was there a plan B at the time?
Well, in my recollection, since about 1982, the CEB had a 20-year generation plan. CEB had a 20-year generation plan optimized, so that the optimized parameter being the long-term cost of supply of electricity. So that's the parameter that would be optimized. Of course, that would have inputs from the government's plans for particularly Mahavali and other irrigation developments. So certain things would be taken as given. So if the government says that we have decided on the Mahavali project, of course that decision would have had a power component as well. So if you take any feasibility study of say Victoria project, you will easily find the power benefits also calculated in terms of what if we do not provide its electricity and what are the alternative sources of producing electricity at that time. So that is accounted for as a benefit of the project. So once the decision is taken, it becomes a given project in the long-term plan. And then the plan goes further into 20 years of the future and factors in, given the options that are available to meet the demand. So of course, in any planning exercise, forecast is the first input that you provide, and of course
Yes.
forecast is also debated, and therefore
Course.
you do sensitivity studies as to what happens if the forecast moves up or down, and then prepare a generation plan and implement it. So of course these are large projects, so delays are inevitable. In the 1970s and 80s, more, if at all there was a delay, that would have been a delay owing to a technical reason. Say, for example, Kotmale power plant, the designers decided that the high pressure tunnel, which is the equivalent of a penstock, need not be lined with steel because the rock was good. But then once they started operating it, they found some weak areas. So therefore, it had to be stopped for several months and a steel lining inserted. But those are the not the delays that we see today. Today we see are all delays in the decision-making process.
Mm-hmm.
So to account for delays, there would have been a plan B. But then
Mm-hmm.
honestly, it's very difficult to have a plan B in
Mm-hmm.
our generation, which is in cost closer to plan A. The plan B is always an expensive plan B
True.
because
True.
of the lead time. That is the time that you require to plan, finance, design, bid, and build a power plant that would produce electricity at a low cost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So once you line up your major projects, both hydros and thermals, to meet your demand over the 20 years, it will be very easy for a politician to say, look, I have cancelled this project. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I would have spent more than 2 seconds to make that statement.
True. True.
I have cancelled this project. 2 seconds. That would mean perhaps a 10-year delay of the generation plant in the country.
True.
Possibly these days,
Mm-hmm. There's no accountability for
about
whoever.
50 billion rupee loss to the economy every year for the next 10 years. It could be
Mm-hmm.
10 or 5, but let's say 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So a project that is ready to go. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
there will be many options appearing. So the decision to go ahead with the project could have been made 2 years ago, and the feasibility and approvals are ready, and maybe the contractors have been selected, and the change of government happens. The new politician says, I can't go back on my word. During my election campaign, I promised the people I will not build it. 5 seconds, okay? And then that would mean the plan B, because you
Mm-hmm.
can't build two power plants to meet the same demand, hoping
True.
that
True.
we cancel one of them,
True.
because these are
True.
capital intensive projects. So therefore,
Mm-hmm.
plan B, unfortunately, is very expensive. That's what we
Mm-hmm.
have been seeing throughout the 1990s and since year 2000 as well, even up to today. We are going on a mixture of plan A and B, and I would say most of it is plan B,
Mm-hmm.
which is very expensive.
Yes.
So that's why
Yes.
you see Sri Lanka went into a situation of even 60% of electricity coming from oil. 60% of electricity coming from oil, even an oil producing country doesn't do it. So that's
Interesting.
the difficulties that one has in having
Mm.
plan B for a power sector project, for
True.
power
True.
sector.
Hello. Did we lose Dr. Siyambalapitiya?
Uh, yes. Dr. Tilak, can you hear us? Yes. So till Dr. Tilak connects, please, our host, to see if you can help him with the technical issues. So the
Mm-hmm.
next point, Tisura, I wanted to talk about is more of a technical nature, in that
Mm-hmm.
what was the process they used for energy planning, and what were the tools they used, and how did the stakeholders have have a method? What was the methodology for stakeholders to impact the energy policy? Was it just the government who decided what the policy goals are, and then the utility made their decisions using an economic process or using a process that
That's
technical
a good
process
question.
to find the best option?
Yes.
So Dr.
Hello.
Tilak,
Yes. Welcome back, Dr. Siyambalapitiya.
Power failure. Sorry about it. We had a power failure.
Yeah.
So now I'm going on with my phone.
oh yeah.
Okay. Hasala. Yes.
We can continue. So
Yes. I think
generation
Hasala.
projects. So okay, we were talking about the planning activity. So planning, even up to date, there is a 20-year plan. Of course, the plan could be debated as much as one likes, but then decisions have to be made. Decisions have to be made because the alternatives are significantly more expensive, which could give rise to problems with supply reliability. So, and once a decision is arrived at on a plan at a power plant, then that should be carried through. So, that of course, what we have seen in the past is that decisions are made, projects are carried through halfway, and then delayed or cancelled or modified, causing enormous losses to the economy.
Hasala.
Yes, to add to that, now this question is more technical in nature, and you should pardon my not knowing about this. So what was the process you used? I guess you were right there from the time you graduated in deciding, making decisions for the energy sector. So what was the planning process at that time for the energy, for the power system? So like, I know that right now they use WASP, and they, that's sort of what the plan is. Was there a separate, like a different method that you used, or was it the traditional method? If so, what was it? And then the second question is, how did you guys get the stakeholders' input into the planning process? So I know that at that point of time, maybe you had the stakeholder as the government, like that's the only stakeholder. But did you like have a way to get input from other interest groups when you are generating your plan?
Yes. So you had two questions. What was the methodology and the software? And the second one was stakeholder participation. So the first one, of course, by about mid 1980s, CB has set up the planning models, which were largely for the power sector and for power generation. They were largely based on the WASP model. Now, why WASP and why nothing? But why not any other package? Of course, looking at the software that was available at that time. To my recollection, there was only one other package by the name of WIGPLAN, WIGPLAN, which was a commercial software package marketed by Westinghouse, which was an American company. Whereas Wheat Automatic System Planning Package was marketed by, not marketed, but provided by the UN through the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it was a UN, I would say, recommended software package, and that was used by many developing countries in the region. So at the time I left CB, there were 50 countries that were using the same software for their long-term planning. So that doesn't mean that today the situation would be the same. So if we mathematically look at it, we are looking at an optimization of an objective function, which is the cost function. And it is a cost optimization. It is not a cost benefit analysis and an optimization of a IRR or a NPV, because the electricity demand is considered to be given. Of course, you could make scenarios of demand and do different types of analysis, but electricity demand is given, and then you have a group of power plants which you have inherited, which are in operation, which have their operating costs and maintenance costs and remaining economic life. Then you have a shopping list of power plants, which could be hydro, thermal, different types of thermal power plants, and now, of course, renewables as well, small and large. And how do you bring in these power plants from this very large and diverse shopping list in such a way that you meet the demand of the country over the next 20 years, so that you meet the reliability criteria and you ensure that the power system has adequate spinning reserve at any given time and at the lowest possible cost. So easy to say, but it's a problem of dynamic programming. So this program uses Bellman's principle of optimality, in which you trace the development of the network over a period of 20 years, and it models about 3,000 different scenarios. I'm not talking about demand scenarios for a given demand, 3,000 different ways of meeting reality, such as the optimal, and goes to the optimal solution. And there are other constraints. There may be a power plant which is very cheap, but you cannot build it tomorrow. It has a lead time. So it might take 4 years or 6 years to build. And the power plant's generator units may be too large for your system. Then the dynamic stability of the system could be constrained. So likewise, the constraints are many. So the user has to very carefully provide the inputs and assess all the parameters and read the input as well. Now, of course, given the fact that Sri Lanka has a predominantly hydroelectric system, at that time, even now, we are still 35% hydro in terms of energy. The input of hydro energy varies, I would say, all the time. But of course, we need to model it. So it is modeled every month is different. And there are 5 hydro conditions, because it could be a low rainfall year, high rainfall year, something in between. So it's a probabilistic simulation. So there's a separate software package. So, I mean, all the people talk about WASP, but it's not the correct thing. But there are a lot of other supporting software to prepare inputs to WASP. So there, some of them were written in-house, some of them were written with the support of international consultants. There were CB engineers doing master's projects on water management. So likewise, it's given the knowledge at that time, I believe we used the best knowledge that we had at that time. Of course, subsequently, many other software packages came into the market. There are, many brand names I can talk about. And CB is already, I think, using some of them. The second question is that how were the stakeholders involved in it? Of course, the stakeholders are government institutions to start off with. So the government stakeholders were covered in the regular communication process. So it would be within the CEB, the board of directors, as well as the ministry secretary and the so-called development secretaries. At that time, there was a grouping called development secretaries. All the secretaries of ministries who are handling development projects would meet once a week and discuss their projects and their interactions. Then, of course, the government departments that would be involved in financing these projects. But public stakeholders being involved, the first recollection I had is 1991. We thought we will, probably 1990, well before PUC was set up, we thought that we should present our generation plan to stakeholders. So I was the chief engineer at that time. So because before that it was not a confidential report, but it was not a report that was widely available for scrutiny by anybody. So we were a group of relatively young, I was only 30 at that time, relatively young people who were of course being criticized all over. We go to a seminar, everybody criticizes you, why are you building this, why are you building that? But then we thought there were questions being raised, although not as widely as it is now being raised. Is it the correct software package? Is there anything else? What are your inputs? You are using a black box, what garbage in, garbage out. So, this kind of, more convenient phrases were being thrown all over, right? So 1990, on a particular day, we had a stakeholder meeting in CB with fairly large, maybe there were about 100 people in that room. When we, to my recollection, presented our generation plan, there were academics as well. Our own professors were sitting in the audience when I was presenting the concluding presentation, and our engineers were presenting how they prepared the data, the water management system, and how the water system is optimized, the interaction between water irrigation, that is hydro irrigation, and water supply. So all these things were presented, and the data was presented, and finally the answer was presented and discussed. So, of course, I would not say it was a formal stakeholder consultation, but stakeholder ideas were brought in. And that went on for a few years until I left CB. Whether they have it now internally in CB, I do not know. But now, as you know, since about 2012, the PUC is organizing stakeholder consultations of this particular subject roughly every other year. So stakeholder consultation, then of course the generation planning book. So we thought, why should we keep it as a secret? Should we keep it as a reserved document? Why not we put it out? So it was we, during my time, that we decided together with my seniors that let's charge the printing cost and let anybody purchase it. So from that day, the generation planning book has a price tag which is written on page 2. I think the first version cost about 150 rupees. At that time, I think now it costs about 1,500 rupees. You can go to CEB and get a slip of paper, pay the amount, and collect a book. And of course, of late, the document is available on the web. So the stakeholder involvement to a certain degree commenced in 1990. Not the way we have it today, but to a reasonable degree.
Very interesting. Yes, Hasala.
So you're referring to the generation expansion plan, right?
That's correct.
So, okay. So this should be probably available online, right? From 1990, like from the time you started this.
Now, of course, not online certainly, because 1990 we did not even have a laser printer. So the first version was printed on a dot matrix printer, right? And Microsoft Word was not available, so it was Word Star or something like that. So you can imagine, basically we spent about 10 days to produce the document after doing all the analysis. So it's not available online. If you want, I have a copy of each of the publications since 1990, but it became available on the web since the PUC process started. Of course, even much later than the PUC process started. Perhaps the last 3 versions or so.
Ouch. Did we... Hasala.
Sorry. Okay,
Yes.
Dr. Tilak has connected, and I was saying that I have all my points were addressed, and if Dr. Tilak is okay, you can just see if he's fine. We are over time right now, but we do have Q&A, Tisura, yes.
Yes, we have a lot of Q&A. I actually I was also thinking, I think Dr. Siyambalapitiya did answer our question, particularly with regards to the generation. Yes, Dr. Siyambalapitiya is back. Hello, Doctor. So yeah, I think you did a very good job. Like, you sort of broadly explained how the planning process was done, especially on the side of the generation planning. I wanted to ask, what were your take on the other side, the transmission planning and the distribution planning, and who was getting connection back in the days. Like, one could argue, like if I'm playing the devil's advocate, one can argue the people who have electricity or the electricity sector was like a very posh man's, like a very connected Colombo elite club. Like takes years for somebody to get a connection into the house. Even if they get a connection, they don't know what to use it for, what to use electricity for. What was your experience on that? Like, you were there previously, like during the 80s and 90s, previously unelectrified areas, that how was the priority given to certain districts? How was sort of priority given? Which house gets electrified first upon others? Could you explain a little bit on that, the other two
All right.
aspects?
I will first explain the planning teams in
Yes.
CEB. So for generation planning, we were 5 of us full time on generation
Mm-hmm.
planning.
Mm-hmm.
So that's me and my team of 4 engineers. Sometimes we did not have all the 4, maybe 3, but definitely at least myself and 3 others. Our full-time task is to analyze all the data, sometimes visit power plants, the existing ones, then organize feasibility studies for future power plants, etc. So it was, and it's even at that time it was a very controversial subject. I had never been to office thinking that, oh, I have nothing to do today. So no such thing happens. Usually what happens is I miss the first train and I miss the second one and I miss the third one and barely catch the last train home after doing all the work. Okay, so that was the usual form because you know, controversy or different types of analysis and the government requests as to what if we delay this project by such and such, can you do the calculations and send us a report by tomorrow morning. So this kind of requests were all coming by, you know, and sometimes I was saying that, look, we are a planning division, we are not the breakdown division for you to tell us today and ask for an answer tomorrow, right? We are planners. We need time to sit down and think and analyze and calculate, form our own opinion, etc. So sometimes we don't have time. And just like today, there were adequate number of committees sitting in various places, and unfortunately, I get fit into all these committees. And as you know, when I get into a committee, I end up being the secretary to the committee because nobody writes. Nobody wants to write. They would like to sit and talk. They want somebody else to write. So anyway, the planning structure was 5 full-timers for generation planning. I'm talking about long-term generation planning. There's a separate generation operations planning team who are working under the system operations branch,
I see.
which we generally call the system control. So
Right. They look at
their
transmission
planning
for that matter.
is at most 3 years ahead. The generation planning for operations is at most 3 years ahead, starting from the next hour. So next hour to 3 years is their and their planning time step is hourly, whereas our planning step is monthly over the next 20 years. So similarly, we had 5 full-timers on transmission planning. Then the distribution groups, depending on the structure, would have had about 5 to, right now I think they have about 20 people doing full-time distribution planning. But right at that time, maybe in the late 1980s, would have been about 5 people planning the distribution network. So
Interesting.
that was the structure. And to answer your, of course, what happens is first the generation plan, because that's the most expensive and most time consuming in terms of implementing the plan. And then the matching transmission plan, which considers the generation locations as well as the forecast from distribution. So they are the people who match generation with distribution and plan the network. So transmission planning team, and they were using load flow models, short circuit, and all this analysis. And subsequently, in early 90s, they purchased the world-class software package. And the distribution team also initially started off with their own analytical models, and subsequently they also have been using standard software packages to model the distribution network. So in most countries, you see generation and transmission link planned very well, but Sri Lanka is different when it comes to distribution planning. Sri Lanka has a distribution plan which covers right up to the customer's doorstep. LECO has it, and CEB is almost there. Whereas
Interesting.
there are many countries, who plan only up to 33 kV level. Thereafter, it's really okay. It's all radial lines. If there is no complaint, why should you have it on a software model, right? But Sri Lanka is one of the countries that does meticulous planning of the distribution network. We are not perfect in terms of operation. We still have problems. But in terms of planning, we are one of the few countries in the region who have good distribution planning. So that's the planning hierarchy that you have, which looks at the longer term. Generation planning covers 20 years into the future. Transmission planning covers 10, and distribution planning covers 5. The reason for distribution planning to be short is that distribution lines can be built fast. Transmission is moderate at 10 years because transmission plan, to plan and build a transmission line, you spend at most 5 years. Actual construction is about 2 years at most, but you need to plan, get clearances, find
True.
funding, etc. It takes 5 years, whereas generation takes longer. So therefore, that's why this planning window becomes shorter when you go down the power system. So that's the answer to your question as to how planning was done. Now, how rural electrification was planned is as follows. You're talking about a situation when there is a very large demand for electrification. So everybody wants electricity. And the distribution teams in CEB had a particular model in which they would first analyze the connectivity of the proposed networks. So which means distribution planning. So which means, let us say a town requires electricity, and what capital investment would we have to make to take electricity to that town? It could be a 5-kilometer 33 kV line and a transformer in the middle of the town and distribution lines going in 4 different directions. So there would be generally an electrical superintendent conducting a survey on the line routes. Then he would conduct a survey by walking along the roads and
Very interesting.
counting the number of houses within 100 meters of the roadway,
Okay.
and using his judgment and classifying those houses as small, medium, and large. Because we need to put them into a distribution planning model to do the network planning. Then you need to put it into an economic evaluation model to calculate the financial and economic cost-benefit analysis.
Right. Right.
So
How much
each
return they're getting.
proposal for electrification will have a FIRR and a EIRR calculated. So EIRR would be used, not FIRR, but EIRR would be used to rank the competing electrification projects.
Very
All right,
interesting. Yes.
town 5 kilometers away is asking for electricity. Another town 2 kilometers away is asking for electricity, and the whole country there. At one time, when I checked, there were 800 such proposals on CB distribution planners' desks. So how to rank them? So now comes Asian Development Bank or Kuwait Fund or Government of Sri Lanka funds saying that we have $50 million to be lent for distribution planning work. So give us your ranking. So there has to be some methodology. We cannot say that politician wanted this and this politician wanted that. Of course, political pressure was severe. So therefore, but then the funding agency, including the Government of Sri Lanka funds, would want a ranking, a scientific ranking of what the priorities are. So there was a threshold, if I remember right, 12% EIRR. And if it is less than 12% EIRR at one time, it would not qualify for financing.
Yes.
Of course, if there's a rich customer who is willing to pay 5 million rupees and get a connection, no problem. CB would, get that money and build that line, but to do it with public funds.
Of
So that's how projects went on. But then, of course, there were other funds. Say, for example, there was a funding arrangement which was called the decentralized budget. Each member of parliament was allowed to select projects in his area, which could be electricity, roads, water supply, or anything, to the value of X million rupees. And he would be given the freedom to spend this budget. So what he does is he gets CEB and water board to make an estimate to provide electricity for this my favored village, right? CEB will not question that, and he would allocate a portion of his budget and pay CEB, and CEB will build the line. All right. So those are the ones that one would say, oh, I spoke to my politician and got it done. True, because the politician was given the full discretion of that amount of fund. But most of the projects were done either government of Sri Lanka funds or largely Asian Development Bank, to a very large extent Asian Development Bank. And there were other bilateral agencies such as Kuwait, China, who would have funded different segments of this long list of electrification projects. So that's how we reached about the year 2010. But when we passed 2010, 2011, 2012, so we were passing 90%, 92%, 93%. At that point, the government decided, all right, now it's the time to say, forget about economic evaluation. The government will spend the balance amount and extend the lines and cover the whole country. So that decision was made, and there was a drive district by district towards 100% electrification, and that was officially completed in 2016. So Sri Lanka is the first country in South Asia, apart from Maldives, of course, to reach 100% electrification.
Of course. Thank you, Dr. Silva. Certainly, it's a very passionate area of yours. I mean, I think you are very knowledgeable, and certainly there's a lot to.
How long do you plan to go on?
Exactly. I just wanted to ask, like, we want to be respectful of your time also, and we've, I think, gone past the earlier agreed upon time. Yes. I'm getting a lot of questions. We are getting a few questions coming up. Maybe do you have a couple of minutes more to sort of talk about that?
I can go on for another 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
If you want, we can fix another time.
Yes, that's true. Let's try to optimize the 5 minutes we have. Hasala, why don't you sort of walk Dr. Siyambalapitiya on the questions? Hasala, your mute button is on.
These questions are a bit strong. Let me go with the smallest one first. So should regulator or any stakeholder, those who know better, have edified the politicians? And I am not sure what it means, but that's what the question is. Should the regulator or any stakeholder, those who know better, have edified the politicians?
Maybe probably educated the politicians.
Oh, educated, yeah.
Educated. Yes, of course. Certainly, to a certain degree, we can educate the politicians, and we have seen results of that. Say, for example, I will give you an example because renewable energy. So Sri Lanka began the renewable energy drive in 1996 by offering a feed-in tariff. So anybody with a 10 megawatt project or less can build it and sell electricity at a published price. So it's not to an individual or a company. Anybody can do that. Of course, he has to get the approvals, find the financing, etc. The contract is standard. The feed-in tariff is standard. So this went on. Certain policy changes were made. But then there was a time that, look, everybody was asking, look, solar PV costs have come down, wind equipment costs have come down. And so therefore, why are you maintaining this very high feed-in tariffs? So there was a requirement to move from feed-in tariff to competitive bidding. And around the same time, the new Electricity Act also re-emphasized the need to go for competitive bidding. So, of course, by this time, the renewable energy investor lobby was strong. And obviously, they prefer a very comfortable fixed feed-in tariff. Any investor would prefer to invest on a project which has an agreement which says by CEB, I will buy all your output and I will buy it for 20 years. I will buy it whether I need or I not. And I will buy it at a given fixed price that will give you an IRR of 18% according to my calculation. If you get your project designed better, you may get even more. There is no other business better than that in this world. Can any investor expect the buyer to sign for 20 years at a fixed price? And the buyer says, even if I don't want, I will buy because your product
True,
is ready. All right.
true,
So
true. Of course.
there has had to be a change in this policy for the sake of the electricity customers, because finally the electricity customer has to pay for it. So therefore, politicians had to be educated amidst a strong lobby from the renewable energy investors that we need to go for competitive bidding. And that transition happened in 2015, 16, 17. Anyway,
True,
that's one of the success stories. Perhaps
true,
most of the
true,
attempts to make politicians more knowledgeable have not been successful.
true,
To my
true.
knowledge, during my time directly working in CB and even thereafter, it had not been successful, but
True.
successes had been there, which were basically rather spontaneous, or the determination of a politician to go ahead with a project rather than fully understanding what the project consequences are.
True, true, true. Absolutely, absolutely. I think our time is up. I think 9:30. We need to be respectful of your time also, Dr. Siyambalapitiya.
Yes.
Do you maybe we'll end with like maybe one answer, like a quick answer to one question from our Facebook listeners. They've asked if you can go back in time and if you have the power to change one thing, one big thing in like how the energy sector evolved, how things progress, what would that be if you had the chance to change one big thing? What would that be?
All right. Uh, I would have I would have gone at best with the rest of the world. I would not try to be very different with the rest of the countries. So therefore, I would have
Yes.
rebuilt the refinery by year 2000, because we are losing $400 million because we have an aging refinery that is badly out of date and under capacity. I would have built coal-fired power plants starting from 1990s and possibly ending by about 2010. And I would have built liquid natural gas importing facilities to be operational by 2015, so that by now we would have got at least 30% of our electricity, which we are now getting from oil, from liquid natural gas, and saved about 80 billion rupees a year. That 80 billion rupees you and I are paying today to burn diesel and
Yes.
import diesel. So that's what's
Yes.
happening. So I've told you what I would have done. Of course, on
Yes.
renewable,
Yes.
I could say a lot more, but let me stop at that.
Yes, I think that's the important part, the learning experiences from your 30, 40 years of experience in your career. So I wanna thank all our listeners, and especially Dr. Siyambalapitiya for joining with us, especially on a Monday morning and a holiday. I think there's a lot for us to discuss. Maybe we'll make time for you in another session. Hasala, do you have some final remarks?
No, I just want to thank you. So this is what we need to be doing, and we need to get the people who have contributed to making the power system what it is today, and
Exactly.
we should be doing this stuff later. So let's have. So if Dr. Tilak would have the space to do that, let's. So Tisura has been the leading voice on this, very passionate young leader. So if you guys want to do it, just comment on the Facebook page and put a like on the page, and just send your comments, your questions to us to ask from Dr. Tilak if he's available and when he's available in our next session. Over to you, Tisura.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much, Dr. Siyambalapitiya, and hope you have a good Monday and sort of enjoy your rest of the day and maybe take a quiet break from other matters. Okay?
No, I'm working today as well.
Oh
It's a
no.
holiday, but I'm working today. There are
Uh-huh.
some calculations to be done on a project. So
Yes.
good. Anyway, thank you for having me on your program. And
Okay.
bye bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siyambalapitiya. Thank you.
All right, guys. Hope to see you on the next episode of this show hosted by Policy.lk. So thanks to our host for the day as well. I hope to catch you in the next show. Bye.